Right, and welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the first podcast, which was just a quick review of some of the specific terminology that we've talked about this first half of the semester. Now what I want to do is to do a quick review of some of the different concepts. And again, just a reminder, you should be moving while you're listening to this podcast. And so you're either walking around the track inside the Coliseum, or you decided to go outside and walk towards the athletic building, or just a circle around campus, or you have gone into the fitness lab outside the back door of our classroom and using a treadmill or a stationary bike or an art trainer if there's not a class in there. And so just make sure that you're moving. Again, we know that there's research that supports that when the mind is active along with the body, it absorbs information for a lot longer time period. Okay. So it's really important. And again, this particular review that we're doing today is really more of just sort of a reminder of some of the very important concepts that we've talked about. Again, everything that we focused on, so all the notes inside Course 10, and of course your chapter information, and of course the information in your Master the Manual. You want to make sure that you have completed all of the chapters that we've talked about in your Master the Manual. I do pull a lot of questions from the Master the Manual that relate to the concepts that we've talked about up to this point. Okay, so this review is really just more of a, hey, don't forget we talked about this. This is really important. You want to make sure that you look over this information. Not so much I'm going to lecture to you again. Okay, that's not really the point of the review. And of course, at the end, when you're finished with listening to both of these podcasts, you'll come back to the classroom and have a chance to be able to ask some questions that you may not be as clear on, so we can make sure we get those taken care of. So as long as you're moving right now, you're good to go. Okay. So just some of the concepts, and again, just to give you an idea, I basically have the notes that I've posted in Course 10 in front of me. That's sort of what I'm using, and my Master the Manual information. That's the sort of the information that I'm sort of reviewing off of right now. So one of the things that we talked about at the very, very beginning of the semester, and then I had to put our information in voice narrated concept because I got sick. But one of the things was the health coach defined. So really, what does it mean to be a health coach? And there's a specific slide within those narrated notes that's going to talk to you about what it means to actually be a health coach. What do they do? Okay, so what are some of the important, very important, critical steps that a health coach would take? Again, effective communication, being approachable, just are a couple examples that come to mind. So I want you to make sure you review that particular slide to make sure you understand what does a health coach actually do. So what are they defined as being able to do? Another narrated slide within that Chapter 1 note section is role modeling. And role modeling is really important for health coaches in the sense because your sort of behavior and your attitude towards the whole lifestyle of living healthy really can be portrayed and reflected to a client. So if you go in with an unorganized, if you go in with a sort of nonchalant attitude, then your client is going to pick up on that very quickly, and they're going to reflect that as well. And so one of the things that I listed in those notes was there are 4 easy steps to role model. And the first one is always do what you are asking them to do. So be expected to do whatever it is that you are asking your client to do. Another one is to continue to always keep learning to be able to grow. So always sort of keeping that cognitive piece, that learning set, that knowledge set sharp so that you continue to grow as a professional. Thirdly, it's always important to remember to stay very positive when working with clients. And then fourth, you want to be professional at all times. Again, we will talk about professionalism, legal guidelines. That's sort of one of the last chapters that we'll talk about at the end of the semester. But again, professionalism at all times is really, really important. Another slide in that section is what is involved in what we call a scope of practice. Really, what do we do and what do we not do? So I want you to understand that particular concept as well. So what is involved in scope of practice for a health coach, specifically what can we not do is something that's really important. And then I also mentioned within that section sort of what is considered the 3 facets of health coaching. Really what this is really what are the top 3 topics, if you will, that clients would actually come to a health coach for. And those 3 top facets are going to be nutrition education, they're going to be personal training for incorporating physical activity, and they're going to come to you for stress and time management. Those are the top 3 facets of health coaching that we see. Another section in those narrated notes has to do with SOAP notes. So you need to know what SOAP stands for. So subjective, objective, assessment, and plan. And this can be reviewed obviously in page 36 of your text. But again, we talked about subjective being the fact that this is something that the client is telling you on how they feel or how they perceive something. So the client's telling you this. Objective is something that is measurable, something that the client can actually measure, and a lot of times this has to do with numbers. Assessment is going to be how are the 2 related. So is what the client is telling you, which is the subjective part, and what you're measuring, which is the objective part, are those relating? Okay, so if a client is telling you that they are staying in compliant with their program, yet when you go and you measure their weight, they've gained 5 pounds. Okay, there's something that's probably a little different there. There's something not matching up. So this is a quick assessment that you're doing, which will then influence your plan. Okay, and so your plan is what do they need to do by the next round or the next session to be able to sort of get back on track or to continue to move forward. Okay, so SOAP notes is going to be really, really important. Okay, let's go to health behavior. And one of the things that we first talked about is theory and models. And so theory, obviously, again, explains patterns. It's really general. It explains why things occur. And a model is going to be sort of purposeful representation of that sort of reality and explain how things actually occur. Okay, so one of the terms that I actually put in the previous podcast was operant conditioning. This is sort of a base principle of why people do what they do and sort of what you see when you're working with clients. But behavior is influenced by its consequences. Okay, so whatever happens actually influences why people do the things they do. That's essentially what the operant conditioning is looking at. Why do people do the things they do? And it is based on the consequences that occur. Okay, there are the ABCs we talked about. So what are the ABCs of operant conditioning? So antecedent, which again, this is the stimulant which causes the behavior. And then, of course, there are consequences of that behavior. There were 4 types of consequences. You may remember they are positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. There's also positive punishment. There's also negative punishment. Okay, so that's sort of the idea of operant conditioning. And then we went into talking about the trans-theoretical model. Okay, so the stages of change. This is the one that we use a lot in health coaching. This is the one that we use a lot in health and wellness. So you have most certainly probably heard trans-theoretical model, the stages of change in other classes, and it's because it's that important. It's introduced, it's reinforced, and it's mastered. That's what we want within our program. And so again, there are core components of the trans-theoretical model. Okay, essentially there are 4 components. One is the 5 stages of change. One is the processes of change. And so I want you to make sure, this is really, really important. Okay, in your textbook, in chapter 3, there is a chart, and I don't have the exact page number, but you'll know it. It's a chart that basically states what the stage of change is, what you're at, what is the intervention, so what is the process of change, and then what are some examples. There is a table, a large table that takes up the whole page. These processes of change, so how to pass from one stage to another, That's really, really important. Okay, so what are the pieces there? And again, I'll have the information for you back in the classroom when you return. The third area is self-efficacy. This really relates to program adoption and maintenance. And of course, the fourth is decisional balance. Okay, so pros and cons, advantages, disadvantages. It really sort of has to be worth it for people. Okay, so the 5 stages of change, which is one of the core components, again, pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance. Easiest way is pre-contemplation, not going to do it. Contemplation is, I might do it. Preparation is, yep, I will. I'm going to do it. Action is, I am doing it now. And of course, maintenance is, I am. Okay, and so again, looking at one of the key indicators here that basically tells us that someone has moved from action to maintenance, which is what we want. We want people to get to maintenance, is that they've been doing something consistently for 6 months, 6 months or longer. Okay, so that's what you're looking for there. Another model we talked about was the health belief model. Again, this has to do with perceived threat. So remember, anything that comes up as a perceived threat is really based around the health belief model. Perceived susceptibility, there's a perceived severity, there are perceived benefits of doing something, there are perceived barriers of doing something. So that's what the health belief model is. We did talk briefly about the socio-ecological model. So interrelations exist between behavior and the environment. So anytime you're looking at socio-ecological model, I want you to think the environment around an individual. That's what that one is, okay? Then we did look at some specific models. We looked at Ardale's, which is, again, based on self-responsibility. So that the environment is a factor for change, but majority of it is that you need to get out of your own way, okay? We looked at Hetler's model, which emphasizes balance. This is probably the most common model, basically looking at all of the areas of wellness and that you need to find balance in all areas of wellness. We did look at the iceberg model, again, what lies beneath, okay? That can be influential. So you have sort of that surface, but that state of health we know is much greater than what lies on the surface. So what lies beneath that can be influential. And then I'm not going to ask you to know all 10 of Arlovsky's 10 tenets of wellness. This is really more information that I shared with you to be able to show you what he perceives as the 10 tenets of wellness. But there's also some cool activities that we did with each one of these that you could use with your clients. So again, you don't need to know all of Arlovsky's 10 tenets, but there's actually some face-to-face coaching sets that you can use there. I thought were really cool. Okay. Then we sort of went into chapter 4, which was rapport and active listening. And there's not a lot in the way of physical content here to review, because we did a lot of actual practice hands-on with building rapport and active listening. Again, what does rapport mean? You learned that in the previous terminology podcast, but active listening we know is a skill set that is really important. Again, the focus is really learning that the primary focus is the client. And again, the health coach needs to sort of move out of the way and just come along for the journey, if you will. And so when we looked at active communication and building rapport, we looked at what are those communication skills. We know that, building rapport and active listening really comes down to some basic things, right? It really comes down to being culturally appropriate. So developing cultural competency is really critical. It's smiling. It's being able to be relaxed. It's remembering people's names. It's head up, good posture. It's finding that common ground. It's learning how to be empathetic. Sometimes you have to mirror and match. When it comes to active listening, we know that this is a conscious effort, okay, to hear and understand people so you can get the whole message, the complete message. So are you paying attention? Do you have eye contact? Are you affirming? So are you shaking your head? Are you smiling? Are you saying yes? Are you providing feedback? So are you paraphrasing or summarizing something? And really try not to interrupt, okay? Unless you need to sort of do something for checking for clarity or misunderstanding, just try not to interrupt, okay? And so we did some rapport building sort of activities there. We talked a little bit about the environment. The environment needs to be free of distractions. Again, do not have your cell phone out on your table. That is a distraction, and it shows people that the cell phone is part of the process and it is important too, and it really is not. So put it away. The desk area, the seating area needs to be clean. It needs to be organized. You know, really it sort of determines the environment in the sense, really is up to me and the client, what's comfortable for them. Sometimes I may meet them at Starbucks, or sometimes we may meet outside for a walk. We don't always have to do a table and a chair kind of setting. So whatever's really sort of beneficial for you and the client there, so that both of you feel open and comfortable. And then we sort of moved on to Chapter 5. Okay, so Chapter 5 dealt with connection through communication. Again, we did a lot in the way here of the DISC personality. So sort of looking at personality and how you actually communicate with people based on the fact that their personalities are very different. And we talked about the importance of how does understanding personality types help really promote effective communication. It is really important to understand that you're not going to always be communicating with people that look like you, sound like you, talk like you, feel like you. And it's really important for you to be able to find that balance and work with different individuals. So again, what is the DISC model? What is D? What is the I? What is the S? What is the C? What does it stand for? And what are those components of each that are important? So what does it mean to be a dominant? Basically direct, decisive, and they are a doer. Okay? And so there is a specific slide within Chapter 5 that goes over that specifically. What does each of those entail? So you'll want to make sure that you understand what those are. Okay? Then we went into motivational interviewing. Again, the number one most important skill in motivational interviewing is really where you're sort of trying to light a fire within a client. You're trying to resolve ambivalence, which is that resistance to change. You're trying to develop intrinsic motivation, and you're trying to evoke. So you're trying to pull something from them, bring up to the surface the thoughts that they really already have and know, but they can actually input into, their own doing. We did talk about essential steps of motivational interviewing. We talked about you have to be able to empathize and use active listening. You have to be able to identify where the client's unhealthy lifestyle really conflicts with where their goals are or where they want their goals to be. You want to be able to avoid resistance by using empathy, not be confrontational. It's really important. Not just do this and you'll be fine, but help them determine what they need to do. And again, try to support the client's self-efficacy by really focusing on confidence building. So really focusing on what is the positive pieces that they've done. Okay. We then talked about questioning skills, because we know that the 4 components of motivational interviewing are OARs. Okay, so open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summary. And so when we looked at open-ended questions or just overall questioning skills, we talked about there are different types. There's essentially 5 different types: open-ended, probing, close-ended, leading, and funneling. Okay, and so open-ended questions is a part of motivational interviewing. It really sort of gets people talking. It's sort of those why questions, or sort of those dead-end questions are actually the why questions. Because if you ask somebody, well, why do you want to change? You're probably going to get, I don't know, or sometimes clients can get sort of defensive. So the why questions are not really the best when it comes to open-ended, but the how, the what, the when, and the where. Those are the questions that we want to focus on when we talk about open-ended. We then talked about close-ended. Okay, so yes and no's. Okay, funnel questions we talked about begin with a close, sort of yes or no sort of move into open-ended. So you start out with closed-ended and you move into open-ended. You're sort of just doing that to get a little bit more detail at the beginning, okay, to make the client feel more comfortable. We talked about probing questions. Probing questions are used when you have highly resistant clients, okay, highly resistant clients, okay. And some types of examples are, why exactly was that? Could you expand? Can you give me an example? Those are some of the things you want to focus on with those. And you got leading questions, okay? Leading questions encourages a move towards that particular goal. So beginning an activity program that includes daily walks sounds like a good idea, right? Doesn't it? Yep, that's a good idea. That's sort of an example of a leading question, okay? Again, I can't stress to you enough the core skills of motivational interviewing: open-ended, affirming, reflection, and summarizing. Okay, so you need to know what entails. Why do we use each of those? Okay, so for example, why do we use open-ended? It allows for exploration. Okay, so open up and share. Why do we affirm? Okay, why do we reflect? What is the purpose there? All right. Now, we did some practice on that. Okay, and then we came and we talked a little bit about some barriers to effective communication, which was important. We talked about how cultural bias can be an effective barrier to communication, so we want to work on being culturally competent, so you're going to have an activity on that. The value of follow-up is really important. Okay, we said there are 3 A's of a high-level practice include being available, being affable, okay, which is sort of friendly and approachable, and being able. Okay, so you have that knowledge, skills, competencies to be able to work with them. All right. So then we go into Chapter 10, okay, which looks at sort of that interview and client screening, if you will. We talked about the initial interview, how you want to be clear, and what does it mean to what is coaching? Because you want to talk to them about what coaching is. And so again, we sort of talked about that in the classroom. That you want to make sure confidentiality is assured. So what are those skill sets, again, that we want to use in that initial interview? So active listening, motivational interviewing, building that rapport and trust, finding that common ground is sort of what we talked about. And then we moved into finding your niche, okay? We said, what is your niche? Which is basically you're going to narrow your focus so that you can speak the language of your clients. And really, your niche is sort of, what is your brand? What are you sort of known for? Okay. So we did an activity with sort of nailing down your niche. And then we talked a little bit about assessment. Okay. So those initial assessment pieces. If I were to say who is the only person that can do a physical health assessment, you would say a physician. Yes, most certainly. Okay, so we know that there are other assessments besides just a physical evaluation that can be done. We know that health coaches can do readiness to exercise. They can look at fitness parameters. They can do motivation or readiness. Again, they can do biometric health risk assessment. They can know when there's criteria for medical clearance that needs to be attained. And so what I shared with you in the classroom, again, really depends on the goals and the plan of the client on which assessments that you would use. But the 3 that I would have all clients complete would be an HRA, so health risk assessment, a readiness to change questionnaire, and a behavioral contract. Okay. And then we did talk about a couple of additional forms to consider. So informed consent, assumption of risk. Again, what is a PAR-Q plus? So I want you to make sure specifically that you look over those forms in Course 10. The main one I want you to focus on is the PAR-Q plus, because it's very drastically different. And so again, it's not the same one that's in your textbook. But what does the PAR-Q plus do? It still asks those 7 questions, but now it sort of moves into some different areas so that a medical clearance is not always going to be necessary, which actually can sort of help keep the process going. Okay, so for some people, if you tell them that you're going to have to go get medical clearance before you can start a walking program, they're most likely going to look at you like you're crazy and tell you that they don't have time for that. Okay, so just sort of take a quick look over that PAR-Q there. And then the last thing that we did was we talked about goal setting. We started out with our Smarty activities, which was a lot of fun. We then talked about why it's important to set realistic goals, because if we get too short goals or too small, then we overachieve and we get bored with that process. But if we set them too far in advance and we can't achieve them, then it sort of sets our self-efficacy back down. And we don't want to do that. We want to find sort of that middle ground that is challenging but achievable. Okay? So on page 361 in your textbook, it talks about SMART goals, and a couple of things I want you to keep in mind. So when we said specific, that goal is not open to interpretation. That's what specific means. There's not, I think that's what that means, or that's very broad. No, it's very specific. Okay? Measurable, I want you to think numbers. Easy there. Okay? Attainable is looking at, is that too high or too low of a goal? All right? Relevant, I want you to think it's important to where they are now in their life. Okay? And then, of course, time-bound, which means you got to include timeline. So I always start out writing a SMART goal with the time first. Okay, so at the end of 2 weeks or by March 28th, I will have blank. Okay, so think about that. All right, so we did a little bit of practice on that. Page 361 gave us some good examples in our textbook of setting some client goal questionnaires. So what are some things you want to ask clients to be able to help them set better goals? So it gives you some samples there of some things to look at. We sort of went back and again talked about the importance of asking those thought-provoking questions by the coach to be able to sort of help with intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Really important there. And then, of course, we talked about the why. The why is more important than the how when it comes to motivating around the ups and downs. I'm going to say that again because it's really important. The why is more important than the how when it comes to motivating around the ups and the downs. Okay? We did talk a little bit about connecting goals with values, and one of the activities that we did looks at the wants activity. This is an example of how you can help a client sort of narrow down their focus. Some clients are going to come into you with 3 very, very, or 4 very, very broad goals, and they want to achieve all of them at the same time. And we know, again, that's a recipe for failure, so you can sort of narrow that down using that wants activity. And we sort of talked about, why do we do this? Why do we have clients narrow it down? Because we know big changes actually can come from small goals. And so we listed 3 key reasons to transform large goals into smaller. So if you think you know what those are, you could pause this podcast and sort of test yourself. But those 3 key reasons to transform large goals into smaller ones are, 1, if you get overly general, or if you get too unrealistic, you can actually demotivate, which is not a good thing. We don't want to demotivate, so we want to avoid that. Small goals actually can direct our energy into sort of manageable action. So again, we don't want to demotivate, and we want to direct our energy. And then transforming sort of these larger aspirations into these small series, if you will, they actually provide a much clearer picture for success. Okay, so we want to make sure that we do that. All right. We talked about the importance of a decisional balance worksheet. So really it recognizes what are the gains and what are the losses that can be consequential of any sort of single decision. So pros and cons. And we gave an example of that. We said ultimately that the goal of every health coach should be to have individuals move to self-reliance, okay? And setting reasonable goals that they can achieve is one of the biggest ways to get an individual to improve self-efficacy, to stay adherent to a program, and to move towards self-reliance. So it's really, really important to be able to do that, okay? And of course, one of the last things we talked about, we mentioned some other strategies that you can use to help people set goals and to help people get to that self-efficacy, self-reliance. Again, There's virtual coaching aspects that you can provide. So technology, apps, text messages, emails, websites, phone calls, personal notes when you're not in a face-to-face session that actually can improve them sticking to their goals. There's other products too that sometimes we refer to clients. So books, support groups, a partner, special classes, workshops, things like that. Okay. So that's just sort of a broad, about 30 minutes or so review of what happens or what we talk about with the concepts. Okay, so I want you to take this review and make sure you understand those concepts, make sure you understand those technologies, those terminologies. And so now what I'd like for you to do is if we have time, I'd like for you to come back to the classroom or just come back to me wherever I'm at, if I'm in the fitness lab or if I'm walking around the top. And if there are additional questions that you have that we didn't answer or that you're still a little confused on, let's go ahead and get those answered for you. But if you don't, then I wish you happy studying. You can go ahead and leave out at this point, and I will see you back in the classroom sharply at 11 o'clock on Wednesday for your midterm. Have a great day.